What is karma?
Karma is a belief shared by several Asian religions including Buddhism and Hinduism. The basic concept is that the position one holds in this life is a result of one's actions and conduct in previous lives or incarnations. Therefore, actions and thoughts in this life can influence one's future destiny. The goal of many Eastern religions is to be freed from the cycle of karma by following certain religious practices. The word originates from the Sanskrit karma, meaning work or fate.
What is Hinduism?
Hinduism, an ancient religion that originated about 1500 B.C. and developed over thousands of years, encompasses the beliefs and practices of the numerous religious sects of India. Each sect has its own philosophy and form of worship. It is a polytheistic religion believing in many gods as well as in one great God, or universal spirit, called Brahman. Hindu doctrine is centered on sacred scriptures including the Veda, which includes the Upanishads. Dialogues describing sacrificial rituals and religious ceremonies, the Puranas, stories about Hindu gods and goddesses, and the Mahabharata, which contains the Bhagavad Gita, or the Song of the Lord, in which the god Krishna discusses the meaning of life with a warrior prince on the eve of battle. Hindus worship alone at temples, which are dedicated to divinities. Followers also practice yoga, believing that it leads to knowledge and union with God.
Who were the Lombards?
The Lombards, too, were a Germanic tribe. They are believed to have originated on an island in the Baltic Sea. In the last century BC, the Lombards moved into Germany and gradually continued southward so that by AD 500, they were settled in present-day Austria. From 568 to the mid-700s, they controlled much of Italy, posing a serious threat to the papal supremacy so that in 754, Pope Stephen II, d. 757, appealed to the powerful Franks for help. By this time the Franks were ruled by Pepin III, called Pepin the Short, c. 714 to 768, who was able to defeat the Lombards. The northern region of Italy, Lombardy, is named for them.
The word crusade. Why do Jews, Christians, and Muslims all claim the same Holy Land?
Palestine, in Southwest Asia, at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, is the Holy Land of Jews. Since it was there that Moses led the Israelites after he led them out of slavery in Egypt, c. 12th century BC. and where they subsequently established their homeland. It is the Holy Land of Christians because it was where Jesus Christ was born, lived, and died. And it was the Holy Land of Muslims, because the Arab people conquered Palestine in the 7th century and, except for a brief period during the Crusades, it was ruled by various Muslim dynasties until 1516, when it became part of the Ottoman Empire. Palestine, which covers an area of just more than 10,000 square miles, is roughly the size of Maryland. Palestine's capital, Jerusalem, is also claimed as a holy city by all three religions. Jews call it the City of David, or the City of the Great King, since it was made the capital of the ancient kingdom of Israel in about 1000 BC. Christians regard it as holy. Because Jesus traveled with his disciples to Jerusalem, where he observed Passover. It is the site of the Last Supper, and just outside the city, at Golgotha, Jesus was crucified. c. 30 AD. Muslim Arabs captured the city in 638 AD, just after Muhammad's death. And, like the rest of Palestine, it has a long history of Muslim Arab rule. Jerusalem, which is now part of the modern state of Israel, is home to numerous synagogues, churches, and mosques. It has also been the site of numerous religious conflicts throughout history. Comes from the Latin word crux meaning cross, and crusaders were said to have taken up the cross. The Crusades began with an impassioned sermon given by Pope Urban II, c. 1035–1099, at Clermont, France, in November 1095. Earlier that year Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Comnenus, 1048–1118, had appealed to Urban for aid in fighting back the fierce Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks preceded the Ottoman Turks. The Seljuks were named for their traditional founder, Seljuk. Seeing the expansion of the Turks, who were Muslim, as a threat to Christianity, the Pope agreed to help. Not only did Urban rally support for the Byzantines in staving off the further advances of the Turks, he also advocated that the Holy Lands should be recovered from them. While the Arab Muslims who had previously controlled the Holy Land had allowed Christians to visit there, the Turks tolerated no such thing. Urban feared that if Palestine were not recovered, Christians would lose access to their holy places altogether. But Urban also viewed the Crusades as a way of unifying Western Europe. The feudal nobility there had long fought against each other. He believed a foreign war would unite them behind a common cause as Christians. Further, he hoped the Crusades would unite Western with Eastern, Byzantine, Europe behind one goal. If successful, the expeditions would also expand the Pope's moral authority across a greater region. En route from Clermont to Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, Turkey, where the crusade was set to begin in August 1096, Urban continued to preach his message at Limoges, Poitiers, Tours, Aquitaine, and Toulouse, France. The message found broad appeal. Even if it appealed to something other than the people's religious sensibilities. Some of those who answered Urban's call took up arms not for the Christian cause, but for their own personal gains, such as acquiring more land, expanding trade, or recovering religious relics. Many peasants took up the cross to escape hardships in 1094. Northern France and the Rhineland had been the site of flooding and pestilence, which was followed in 1095 by drought and famine. The First Crusade actually turned into two. A peasants' crusade, which had never been Urban's intent, had gone ahead of the official expedition, and many lives were lost. It ended in failure. But the planned expedition, called the Crusade of Princes, ultimately succeeded in capturing Jerusalem in 1099. Western Christian feudal states were established at Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli, all of which were placed under the authority of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But Urban did not live to see the recovery of the Holy Land, and the Christian hold on Palestine was not to last. As the Muslims refused to give up the fight for control of lands they too considered to be holy. The second, 1147-49, third, 1189-92, fourth, 1202-04, fifth, 1217-21, sixth, 1228-29, seventh, 1248-54, and eighth, 1270, crusades were prompted by a mix of religious, political, and social circumstances. The Crusades ended in 1291, almost 200 years after they had started, when the city of Acre, the last Christian stronghold in Palestine, fell to the Muslims, ending Christian rule in the East. Yet another crusade, in 1212, was particularly tragic, called the Children's Crusade. The expedition was led by a young visionary who had rallied French and German children to believe they could recover Jerusalem, since, as poor and faithful servants, they would have God on their side. As the children marched south across Europe, many of them died even before reaching the Mediterranean coast. Some believe that the crusade was sabotaged, resulting in the children being sold into slavery in the East.
What happened to the Ostrogoths?
The eastern division of the Goths, the Ostrogoths, were overrun and absorbed by the Huns in 370. When the powerful Hun leader, Attila, died in 453. Subjects of the Huns revolted and the Ostrogoths regained their freedom. Theodoric, c. 454-526, became the ruler of the Ostrogoths in 493, and it was under his leadership that the group invaded northern Italy, where they remained. In the middle of the following century, they were overthrown by the armies of the Byzantine Empire. Like other Germanic tribes, the Ostrogoths were absorbed into the various groups of Europe.
What happened to the Visigoths?
When both the Visigoths and Ostrogoths were attacked by the Huns in 370, the Visigoths fared better, many of them fleeing into a Roman province. In 378 the Visigoths rebelled against the Roman authorities. On horseback, they fought the Battle of Adrianople, in present-day Turkey, destroying a Roman army and killing Rome's eastern emperor, Valens, c. 328–378. The Visigoths' introduction of the cavalry. Troops trained to fight on horseback. As part of warfare determined European military, social, and political development for the next 1,000 years. After the Battle of Adrianople, the Visigoths moved into Italy, and under the leadership of their ruler, Alaric, c. 370–410, sacked Rome in 410, an event that signaled the beginning of the decline of the Roman Empire. After the success of the Visigoths, one tribe after another invaded the empire. The Visigoths continued westward into Gaul, and there set up a monarchy that consisted of much of France and Spain and was centered in Toulouse. But in 507 they were driven out by the Franks, and the Visigoths withdrew into the Iberian Peninsula, present-day Spain and Portugal. Toledo was established as the capital of the Visigoth kingdom in 534. Roderick, or Rodrigo, the last of the Visigoth kings in Spain, was defeated and killed in 711 during a battle with the Muslims, Moors, who invaded from northern Africa. The Muslims went on to rule most of the Iberian Peninsula until the mid-1400s.
What is Shinto?
Shinto is the dominant religion of Japan. Its traditions call for the reverence of ancestors, prayer, and the observance of rituals. It is polytheistic, believing in many gods, kami, who are thought to be the forces behind nature as well as behind human conditions such as sickness, healing, and creativity. Followers of the Shinto religion believe these spirits are housed in shrines. Private shrines are erected in homes while public shrines can be highly elaborate, including multiple buildings as well as gardens. The latter are the goals of many religious pilgrimages. Pilgrims pray and make offerings, of money and flowers, to the spirits. Originating in Japan in ancient times, Shinto has an interesting modern history. In 1882 religious organizations were divided into two groups: state shrines and sectarian shrines. State Shinto was controlled by the government, which went so far as to proclaim divine origins for the Japanese emperor. After World War II, 1939–45, state Shinto crumbled and Emperor Hirohito, 1901–1989, was compelled to renounce his divinity. Sectarian Shinto religion still thrives in Japan today, where it has more than 3 million followers.
When did the Sunni and Shia sects of Islam form?
It was during the 600s, not long after Muhammad's death, when Muslims split into two main divisions, Sunni and Shia. Sunnite Muslims, who account for most of the Islamic world today, believe that Islamic leadership passes to caliphs, temporal and spiritual leaders, who are selected from the Prophet Muhammad's tribe. The Shiites believe, however, that the true leaders of Islam descend from Ali, c. 600 to 661, Muhammad's cousin and the husband of Muhammad's daughter, Fatima. Called the Shining One, c. 616 to 633. Ali, who was the fourth caliph, 656 to 61. Is revered by Shiites as the rightful successor to the Prophet Muhammad and are led by his descendants. Shiites form the largest subgroup, but there are other sects within Islam as well. The Wahhabi Muslims are a puritanical sect. The Baha'is emerged from the Shiites. And the Ismaili Khoja Muslims have been in existence almost from the beginning of Islam. While Islamic practices may vary somewhat among the sects, all Islamic people uphold the 5 pillars of faith.
What are the 10 Commandments?
Also called the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments appear in the Bible in the book of Exodus 20:2-17, and in the book of Deuteronomy 5:6-21. They are considered the summary of divine law as handed down by God to Moses, who not only heard them but received them in the form of writing on 2 stone tablets as he stood atop Mount Sinai, what is known today as Gebel Musa, on Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, where he had been summoned by God. According to the Bible, the commandments, which are paramount in the ethical systems of Judaism and Christianity, are these: 1. Do not have any other God besides the Lord God. 2. Do not have or worship idols, carved images. 3. Do not make wrong use of the name of the Lord your God, or do not take the name of the Lord in vain. 4. Keep the Sabbath day holy. 5. Honor your mother and your father. 6. Do not commit murder. 7. Do not commit adultery. 8. Do not steal. 9. Do not give false evidence against your neighbor. And 10. Do not covet your neighbor's household or lust after your neighbor's spouse.
Who were the Saxons?
Saxons were a Germanic people who in the 2nd century lived in southern Jutland, in the area of present-day Denmark and northwestern Germany. During the next 2 centuries the Saxons raided the coastal areas of the North Sea. By about 400, they had reached northern Gaul, the ancient country that occupied the area west and south of the Rhine River, west of the Alps, and north of the Pyrenees Mountains. Roughly modern-day France, Belgium, Luxembourg, part of Germany, and part of the Netherlands. By about 450, as Roman rule was declining, the Saxons had reached England, where they merged with the Angles and began setting up Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Anglo-Saxons dominated England until it was conquered by Danish Vikings, under the leadership of Canute, in 1016.
Who were the barbarians?
The term is used to refer to any of the Germanic tribes that, during the middle of the first millennium A.D., beginning about 400, repeatedly attacked Rome, eventually conquering it and dividing the territories of the West Roman Empire into many kingdoms. While what was the East Roman Empire survived as the Byzantine Empire. The Germanic tribes included the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, and the Lombards.
Is it true that Moses stuttered?
Yes, the Bible indicates that Moses had a speech impairment, which caused him to fear the mission that God gave him. In the book of Exodus, 4:10, just after Moses has been called by God and told to go to the Pharaoh and lead the Israelites out of Egypt, he appeals to the Lord, saying, "If you please, Lord. I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue," and, later, 4:13, "If you please, Lord, send someone else." God reassures Moses and instructs him to go meet his brother Aaron the Levite, who is eloquent and will speak to the people for Moses.
What is an infidel?
Derived from the Latin infidelis, meaning unbelieving or unfaithful. The term was used by the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages, 500-1350, to describe a threat posed by Muslims as the Moors. Muslims from North Africa moved into Spain early in the 8th century, and the Seljuk Turks conquered much of Asia Minor during the 11th century. Medieval Christians, of which there were a growing number, became increasingly fearful of growing Muslim influence. Not only were people of the Islamic faith occupying lands that were formerly Christian, they soon prevented Christian pilgrims from entering their holy land in the Middle East. The Church responded to the so-called infidels by inspiring Western Europeans to take up arms in the Crusades, which began in 1095 and ended unsuccessfully in 1291. In another effort to drive back Muslim expansion, in 1231 Pope Gregory IX, c. 1170-1241, issued a papal bull creating the Inquisition, the system by which heretics were discovered and punished. Many of them were burned at the stake. The Moorish dominance of the Iberian Peninsula, present-day Spain and Portugal, lasted hundreds of years before the North Africans were driven out by armies of the Christian states. Thereafter, during the reign of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, Spain embarked on a period of profound suspicion. It conducted the Spanish Inquisition, by which anyone thought to be an infidel. The definition, now broadened to include Jews, was discovered and punished.
Who were the Angles?
The Angles were yet another Germanic tribe. They originated in Schleswig in northwestern Germany. Like other Germanic peoples, they were on the move by the 5th century. Arriving in England, the Angles joined the Saxons, also a Germanic-speaking people. After which time they together became known as Anglo-Saxons, a term referring to any non-Celtic settler of Britain.
What are Islam's 5 pillars of faith?
Muslims practice adherence to the 5 pillars of faith. 1. Belief in Allah as the only God and Muhammad as his prophet. 2. Prayer 5 times daily at dawn, at noon, in the afternoon, in the evening, and at nightfall. 3. Giving alms to the poor. 4. Fasting from dawn until dusk during the holy month of Ramadan. And 5. Making the pilgrimage, Hajj, to the holy city of Mecca at least once during their lifetime.
Who were the Huns?
The Huns were a nomadic Central Asian people who, in the middle of the 4th century A.D., moved westward. They first defeated the Alani, a group in the Caucasus mountain region. Between the Black and the Caspian Seas, and then conquered and drove out the Goths. Unified by the ruler Attila in 434, the Huns gained control of a large part of Central and Eastern Europe by about 450. The Italian countryside was ravaged in the process, and many people sought refuge on the numerous islands in the lagoon of Venice. The settlement later became the city of Venice. With the death of Attila in 453, the subjects of the Huns revolted and defeated them. The Huns were later absorbed into the various peoples of Europe.
Who were the Goths?
The Goths were a group of Germanic tribes who originated in what is now Scandinavia. As early as the 3rd century AD, the Goths invaded the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. During the following century, they divided into 2 groups, a western group known as the Visigoths, who predominated north of the lower Danube River, in Central Europe, and an eastern group known as the Ostrogoths, who were situated north of the Black Sea, between Europe and Asia. Along with other tribal Germanic peoples, the Goths brought the downfall of the Roman Empire.
Where does the word Pope come from?
The word pope is derived from the Greek word papas, meaning Papa, Father. The Pope is also referred to as the Holy Father, the Vicar of Christ, and Pontiff.
What was the controversy with Thomas Becket?
Archbishop of Canterbury Thomas Becket, c. 1118 to 1170, was killed by knights in the service of England's King Henry II. 1133 to 1189, he had refused to be subservient to the monarch. In the long struggle between church and state, the story of St. Thomas Becket is a dramatic chapter. Born in London in about 1118, when he was in his 20s, Becket entered into service for the Archbishop of Canterbury, the spiritual head of the Church of England. He subsequently held various church offices, including archdeacon. When Henry II was coronated in 1154, becoming the worldly leader of the Church of England, he found in Becket one of his most vigorous champions. In 1162 Henry made him Archbishop of Canterbury. But a transformation soon occurred in Thomas Becket, who put his spiritual duties first and began defending the church against the king's power. Henry, eager to increase royal authority, was determined to regain control over the church. A bitter struggle ensued between the two former friends. At one point, Becket fled the country because he was in fear for his life. When he returned to England 6 years later, in 1170, he renewed his opposition to the king, but nevertheless forced a reconciliation with him. Henry was still irked by Becket's open defiance to his authority, and he suggested to his knights that one among them might be brave enough to do away with him, ending the king's troubles. 4 knights took the king at his word, and on December 29, 1170, they found Becket in Canterbury Cathedral and killed him as he made his evening prayers. Henry later did penance for the crime. Becket was canonized 3 years later.
What are the Dead Sea Scrolls?
The scrolls are ancient manuscripts of great historical and religious importance. They were found in dry riverbed caves on the northwestern side of the Dead Sea, a salt lake situated between Israel, the West Bank, and Jordan. More than 800 scrolls have been found, with the most famous discoveries made in 1947. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found miles apart at a number of different sites, including Khirbet Qumran in the West Bank, formerly Israel. The texts date to different centuries but include fragments of every book of the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, except the Book of Esther. Some texts are almost identical to Bible texts used today, showing that much of the Old Testament is the same as it was 2,000 years ago.
How many popes have there been?
The number given by the Vatican is 265, including Pope Benedict XVI. The former German cardinal who was elected on April 19, 2005, to succeed John Paul II, 1920 to 2005. Other lists cite 266 popes. The discrepancy arises around Stephen II, who died in 752 after he was elected but before he could be consecrated. Except for a few brief interruptions when the papacy was vacant. The Roman Catholic Church has been led by the Pope as its visible head, and Jesus Christ as its invisible head. Since Jesus said to the Apostle Peter, "And I say also unto thee, that thou art Peter. And upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it," Matthew 16:18. The Apostle Peter, who was earlier called Simon and is also called Simon. Peter became the leader of the Christian community after the crucifixion of Christ. And he made Jerusalem the headquarters of his preaching in Palestine. According to 2nd century sources, Peter traveled to Rome about 55 AD and became the city's first bishop. During the persecution of Christians under Roman Emperor Nero, 37 to 68 AD, Peter was crucified on Vatican Hill in the year 64. He died a martyr and was canonized. St. Peter's Church, the principal church of the Christian world, is said to have been built over Peter's burial place. These events in Rome during St. Peter's time long after gave the city special status within the church. It further established the site of the Papal Palace in Vatican City, which is an independent state that lies within the city of Rome. And the majority of popes, all but 18, have been Italian. When John Paul II, who was born in Poland, was elected pope in 1978, he was the first non-Italian pope since 1523.
Why is the Exodus from Egypt so well known?
The Exodus of the Jews from Egypt, an event recorded in the Bible and corroborated by historical evidence, is well known to Jews and non-Jews alike, since the event, which Jews commemorate with Passover, came to symbolize departure from oppressive conditions, for the Israelites had been enslaved in Egypt. According to the Bible, the Old Testament books of Genesis and Exodus, the ancestors of the Israelites had settled in the Nile River delta of Egypt 430 years before the Exodus, or about the 17th century BC. A change of dynasty caused the Israelites, because of their growing numbers, to be looked upon with hostility. They were put to work as state serfs in the construction of cities. The biblical account tells about a series of confrontations between Ramses II, the pharaoh of Egypt, and the prophet Moses, who had been commissioned by God to lead his people to the promised land. The pharaoh refused to allow the Israelites to leave Egypt but was later convinced, through a series of divine signs including the 10 plagues, to permit them to go. The flight from Egypt and the promised land have come to symbolize freedom and the realization of hopes.
How were the Gauls related to the Celts?
The ancient Gauls were a Celtic people who spoke forms of the Celtic language. They occupied the ancient country of Gaul, a region west of the Rhine River and north of the Pyrenees Mountains, an area that today consists of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, part of Germany, and part of the Netherlands. The Gauls were led by priests, who were called Druids. By 390 BC the Gauls had moved southward, across the Alps and into Italy. In the 3rd century BC, they battled the powerful Romans and were briefly successful. Ultimately, however, they were defeated, becoming subjects of Rome. Later, under Julius Caesar, the Romans conquered all of Gaul, so that by 50 BC the region became part of the Roman Empire. 5 centuries later, Gaul was overrun by the Franks, for whom the region was named. Thus, French people today are descendants of the Gauls. Also, the Galatians, one of the Christian peoples to whom the Apostle Paul wrote while he was in jail, were descendants of the Gauls who settled in Macedonia and Asia Minor, the peninsula between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, which today is occupied by Turkey.
Why is Mecca a holy city for Muslims?
Mecca, in western Saudi Arabia, is the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad, c. 570, and was his home until the year 622, when those who opposed him forced him to flee to Medina, a city about 200 miles north of Mecca. Muhammad later returned to Mecca and died there in 632. Mecca is also the site of the Great Mosque, which is situated in the heart of the city. The outside of the mosque is an arcade, made up of a series of arches enclosing a courtyard. In that courtyard is the most sacred shrine of Islam, the Kaaba, or Kaaba, a small stone building that contains the black stone, which Muslims believe was sent from heaven by Allah, God. When Muslims pray, 5 times a day, according to the 5 pillars of faith, they face the Kaaba. It is also the destination of the Hajj, or pilgrimage.
What are the divisions of the Hebrew Bible?
The Hebrew Bible is divided into 3 main sections called the Law, or Torah, the Prophets, and the Writings, or Hagiographa. The Hebrew Bible is accepted by Jews as sacred. The word testament comes from the ancient word testamentum, meaning covenant with God. Much of the Hebrew Bible recounts Jewish history, demonstrating faithful observance to their agreement with God. The law consists of those 5 books written by Moses, and these recount creation, early traditions, the lives of the patriarchs of Israel, early events of the Israelites, and entrance into the Promised Land. Torah translates as teaching, and Jews, as do Christians. Look to these first 5 books of the Bible for guidance. The prophets consists of the books of the former prophets, books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings, and the latter prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the teachings of 12 other prophets. The books of the prophets chronicle historical events. But according to the Jewish tradition, these books also teach that people must obey God's laws. The writings consist of 13 books, which are believed to have been written by poets and teachers.
When was the Bible written?
The Old Testament, or Hebrew Bible, which is called the Book of Books because of its profound influence, was written thousands of years ago. Scholars disagree about exactly when or how the books were written. But it is generally accepted that the earliest parts of the Bible originated during the time of Moses, or Moshe. The Hebrew prophet and leader, about the 14th to the 13th century BC. Moses is believed to be the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, called the Pentateuch or the Law of Moses. The books include Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These are believed to have been revealed to Moses by God. Scholars believe that much of the material in the Bible was recited aloud as part of an oral tradition long before it was written down, which complicates the matter of assigning dates to the various books. The books of the prophets, Joshua, Isaiah, Samuel, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, etc., are believed to have been written and collected during the kingdoms of Israel, c. 1020 to 722 BC, and Judah, c. 933 to 586 BC, and shortly thereafter. Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs, Ruth, Ecclesiastes, and Chronicles were written in the time of King David and King Solomon during the 10th century BC or shortly after 1000 BC. The books of Job, Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah are believed to have appeared between 600 BC and 100 BC. The 27 books of the New Testament, upon which Christianity is based, were written on papyrus scrolls, none of which remain. Dating the writing of the New Testament is difficult, but the historical events referred to in the books indicate they were written shortly after the time of Christ and probably before AD 100.
Who wrote the Quran?
The Quran, or Quran, contains the holy scriptures of Islam, and was written by the followers of the Prophet Muhammad, c. 570 to 632. It is not known whether these texts were written down during Muhammad's lifetime or after his death. It is known that the texts were codified, organized into a body, between 644 and 656. Muslims believe the angel Gabriel revealed the book to Muhammad, beginning in 610 and continuing until the Prophet's death in 632. The Quran. Meaning recitation, consists of 114 verses, ayahs, that are organized in chapters, surahs. Muslims believe the beautiful prose of the Quran to be the words of God Himself, who spoke through Muhammad. Further, it is believed to be only a copy of an eternal book, which is kept by Allah. The Quran is also held up by Muslims as proof that Muhammad was indeed a prophet, since no human is capable of composing such text. Among the most widely read texts today, the Quran is also taught orally, so that even Muslims who are illiterate may know and be able to recite verses.
What is the difference between the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament?
The Hebrew Bible is made up of 24 books. The Old Testament used by Christians consists of the same books as those of the Hebrew Bible, but they are arranged differently and many books are divided, resulting in more books in the Old Testament than in the Hebrew Bible. Among Christians, the Old Testament varies between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. Protestants include 39 books in the Old Testament, while Roman Catholics add 7 books, called the Apocrypha, to their version, for a total of 46 books. The books of the Apocrypha resemble those of the Old Testament, but since they were written later than most of the Old Testament, probably 300 BC/AD 70, both Protestants and Jews treat them separately. The Bibles used by all three religions, Judaism, Roman Catholicism, and Protestantism, begin with the same 7 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Judges. The first 5 of these were written by Moses.
What were the 10 plagues?
The 10 plagues were delivered by God to the people of Egypt as a way of convincing the Pharaoh that he was to let the Israelites go so Moses could lead them out of bondage and into the promised land. The plagues were, in the order described in Exodus: 1. Water turned into blood; 2. Frogs; 3. Gnats; 4. Flies; 5. Pestilence; 6. Boils; 7. Hail; 8. Locusts; 9. Darkness; and 10. Death of the firstborn. It was not until the 10th plague had been delivered that the Pharaoh agreed to let the Israelites leave.
How does the Catholic Church determine who will be Pope?
Present-day procedures for electing a pope who serves the Church until his death vary from those of earlier times. Before the 300s, the clergy of Rome and the outlying areas cast votes in what was essentially a local papal election. Throughout history, some of Europe's powerful rulers tried to influence the outcome of papal elections in order to establish a pope who would be favorable to their leadership. This interference in the process sometimes resulted in disputes over who was the rightful pope, with more than one pope claiming authority based on the support of emperors or factions within the church. Those claiming to be popes but who were considered illegitimate are called anti-popes. The process observed by the Roman Catholic Church today was established over time. The first important decision came in 1059 when Pope Nicholas II, c. 980-1061, declared that papal electors must be cardinals. In 1179 the Third Lateran Council established that all cardinals have an equal vote and that popes may only be elected by a two-thirds majority. This came after Pope Alexander III, c. 1105-1181, had been opposed by three anti-popes. Pope Gregory X, 1210-1276, after being elected to the papacy following a 3-year vacancy, assembled the Council of Lyon in 1274, which decreed that the cardinals must meet within 10 days of a pope's death to determine the papacy. Further, the council required that the cardinals remain together in strict seclusion until they have elected a new pope. Today, when a pope dies, the dean of the Sacred College notifies all cardinals of the vacancy. The cardinals convene at Vatican City in a meeting that is required to begin within 20 days of the pope's death. Any of 3 electoral processes may be used: ballot, which is most common, unanimous voice vote, or the unanimous decision of a committee of 9 to 15 delegates. 4 votes are taken a day, 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, until there is a two-thirds majority vote. As soon as a decision is reached, the dean asks the pope-elect if he accepts the position. Once he accepts, he is considered pope and has full authority over the church. He then proceeds to select a name, which he announces to the cardinals. Following these private meetings, the results of which are eagerly awaited by devout Roman Catholics, white smoke is sent up a chimney of the Vatican Palace, signaling to the crowd in St. Peter's Square that the election is complete. The smoke is created by burning ballots from elections in which a two-thirds majority was not achieved are also burned, but in a way that creates black smoke. In this way, the public is apprised of the cardinal's decision-making process. The oldest cardinal has the honor of making the official announcement to the people in St. Peter's Square. Then the people are blessed by the new pope in his first official act. The coronation of the pope is held later.
What were the Crusades?
The Crusades were a series of 9 Christian military expeditions that took place during the end of the 11th century and throughout the 12th and 13th centuries. The stated goal of the Crusades was to recover from the Muslims the Holy Land of Palestine, where Jesus Christ, C6b.ca.d30, lived.
What are the characteristics of medieval times?
Although the Middle Ages were shadowed by poverty, ignorance, economic chaos, bad government, and the plague, it was also a period of cultural and artistic achievement. For example, the university originated in medieval Europe. The first university was established in 1158 in Bologna, Italy. The period was marked by the belief, based on the Christian faith, that the universe is an ordered world, ruled by an infinite and all-knowing God. This belief persisted even through the turmoil of wars and social upheavals. And it is evident in the soaring Gothic architecture, such as the Cathedral of Chartres. France, the poetry of Dante Alighieri, 1265-1321, the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, 1225-1274, the Gregorian chant, and the music of such composers as Guillaume de Machaut, c. 1300-1377.
What is Zen?
Also called Zen Buddhism, it is a sect of Buddhism practiced predominantly in Japan and China. The religion is based on meditation rather than on the strict moral doctrine of Buddhism. It was founded in China in the 5th century AD by Bodhidharma, an Indian Buddhist monk and missionary. He taught that sudden enlightenment can be achieved through the practice of meditation, or wall gazing. The religion defines enlightenment as the direct seeing of one's original nature.
What impact did the Crusades have on Western Europe?
The goals of the Crusades were not accomplished. The Holy Land had been recovered, but Christians were unable to keep control of it. And while the Western Europeans had joined with the Eastern, Byzantine, Christians in their fight against the Muslims, the two groups remained bitter toward each other, which likely contributed to the fall of Byzantium to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Nevertheless, the Crusades had a lasting effect on the European economy. During the expeditions, trade routes were established, new markets opened, and shipbuilding was improved. Having fortified themselves for the fight, the Christian monarchies in Western Europe emerged from the Crusades in 1291 as strong as if not stronger than before Pope Urban had first rallied the troops in 1095.
Who were the Vandals?
Like the Goths, the Vandals were a Germanic people who originated in an area south of the Baltic Sea in what is now Scandinavia. By AD 100 they had moved into the southern region of, present-day, Poland. But there they eventually found themselves threatened by the Huns. And so they began moving westward late in the 4th century. Early in the 5th century, the Vandals overran Gaul, in Western Europe, Spain, and northern Africa, where they eventually settled. Between 428 and 477 the Vandals were ruled by the powerful king Genseric. Under his reign, they ravaged Rome, in 455. Their pillage was so thorough that the word Vandal is used to describe anyone who willfully destroys property that is not theirs. In 533 and 534, like the Ostrogoths, the Vandals were defeated by armies of the Byzantine Empire.
Who were the Franks?
The Franks were another Germanic people who divided into two branches. The Salians, who settled near the lower Rhine River, near the North Sea. And the Ripuarians, who moved into what is now Germany, along the middle Rhine River. In 359 the Franks entered into the Roman Empire as allies, but in 481 Clovis, c. 466 to 511, gained the Salian Frank kingship. By 486 he had begun a campaign of aggression, conquering Romans, Gauls, Visigoths, and other groups. Under this cruel and cunning king, the Franks soon controlled all of Europe from the Mediterranean to the English Channel, and from the Pyrenees Mountains to the Rhine River. Even after Clovis's death, the Franks maintained their stronghold in the region, which is how France eventually got its name. Though Clovis was a powerful ruler, he was succeeded as king of the Franks by the even more powerful Charlemagne, also called Charles the Great, 742 to 814, who ruled from 771 to 814, creating a vast empire. In 800 Pope Leo III, c. 750 to 816, crowned him Emperor of the West, thus initiating the Holy Roman Empire. It was after Charlemagne that the empire of the Franks began to break up, becoming the kingdoms of France, Germany, and Italy.
What caused the East-West schism in the Catholic Church?
During the Middle Ages, 500-1350, cultural, geographical, and even political differences caused an increasingly wide divide between the Catholic churches in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, as well as in parts of Western Asia, and West, the Catholic churches of Western Europe. In the 800s a series of theological disputes began between the highest authority of the Eastern, Byzantine churches, called the Patriarch of Constantinople, also called the Ecumenical Patriarch, and the Pope, particularly about the Pope's authority over Christians in the East. Finally, in 1054, Pope Leo IX 1002 to 1054, issued an anathema, a formal curse, against the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, c. 1000 to 1059, excommunicating him and his followers from the Roman Catholic Church. The Church had officially split. Thereafter the Eastern Orthodox churches would accept the Patriarch of Constantinople as the highest church authority, in other words, they did not acknowledge the primacy of the Pope, and they would follow the Byzantine rite, ceremonies, in the West. Roman Catholics followed the Latin rite and continued to regard the Pope as the Holy Father. When the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, Turkey, in 1453, Orthodox Christians in the East came under Muslim rule. This lasted into the 1800s. Though there are still differences between the Eastern Orthodox churches, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, etc., and the Roman Catholic Church today, the rift between them was healed in 1964 when Pope Paul VI, 1897 to 1978, met with Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras I, 1886 to 1972, in Jerusalem. The following year, the two religious leaders lifted the mutual anathemas between their churches.
What caused the East-West schism in the Catholic Church?
During the Middle Ages, 500-1350, cultural, geographical, and even political differences caused an increasingly wide divide between the Catholic churches in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, as well as in parts of Western Asia, and West, the Catholic churches of Western Europe. In the 800s a series of theological disputes began between the highest authority of the Eastern, Byzantine churches, called the Patriarch of Constantinople, also called the Ecumenical Patriarch, and the Pope, particularly about the Pope's authority over Christians in the East. Finally, in 1054, Pope Leo IX, 1002 to 1054, issued an anathema, a formal curse, against the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, c. 1000 to 1059, excommunicating him and his followers from the Roman Catholic Church. The Church had officially split. Thereafter the Eastern Orthodox churches would accept the Patriarch of Constantinople as the highest church authority, in other words, they did not acknowledge the primacy of the Pope, and they would follow the Byzantine rite, ceremonies, in the West. Roman Catholics followed the Latin rite and continued to regard the Pope as the Holy Father. When the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, Turkey, in 1453, Orthodox Christians in the East came under Muslim rule. This lasted into the 1800s. Though there are still differences between the Eastern Orthodox churches, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, etc., and the Roman Catholic Church today, the rift between them was healed in 1964 when Pope Paul VI, 1897 to 1978, met with Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras I, 1886 to 1972, in Jerusalem. The following year, the two religious leaders lifted the mutual anathemas between their churches.
When was the Bible translated into English?
The earliest English language translations of any part of the Bible first appeared around the 8th century. The Vespasian Psalter was a primitive English translation of the Latin text of the Book of Psalms. But the Latin translation of the Bible, called the Vulgate, continued to prevail for several centuries as the version authorized by the Roman Catholic Church. It was not until the 1300s that the first comprehensive translation into English was undertaken by the controversial religious reformer John Wycliffe, c. 1330–1384. Wycliffe, an English theologian and professor at Oxford University, was a forerunner of the Protestant Reformation. He believed that all authority, religious and secular, can be derived only from God. And he attacked the worldliness of the medieval church. In 1377 Pope Gregory XI, 1329–1378, accused Wycliffe of heresy, but the reformer escaped trial. Nevertheless, he spent the rest of his life under the watchful eye of the Church, which did everything in its power to curtail Wycliffe's activities, eventually forcing him to retire. He managed to initiate the first complete translation of the Bible, which was finished by his followers. As an early leader of the Reformation, the Anglican priest William Tyndale, c. 1494–1536, believed that the scriptures needed to be available to everyone, not just the scholarly or learned. So he began translating the New Testament and the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, from Greek and Hebrew into English. He also referred to his friend Martin Luther's, 1483–1546, German translation of the Bible. But Tyndale was unable to get his English translation published at home in England, where the Anglican Church was determined to seize the work. In 1524 he fled the country for Germany, where he worked for the next 5 years to get his translations into print. Copies of it were smuggled back into England. Eventually he was arrested in Antwerp, Belgium, and condemned for heresy by the Roman Catholic Church. Tyndale was burned at the stake in 1536. His version later became the chief basis for the King James Version of the Bible, 1611.
When was the Bible translated into English?
The earliest English language translations of any part of the Bible first appeared around the 8th century. The Vespasian Psalter was a primitive English translation of the Latin text of the Book of Psalms. But the Latin translation of the Bible, called the Vulgate, continued to prevail for several centuries as the version authorized by the Roman Catholic Church. It was not until the 1300s that the first comprehensive translation into English was undertaken. By the controversial religious reformer John Wycliffe, c. 1330 to 1384. Wycliffe, an English theologian and professor at Oxford University, was a forerunner of the Protestant Reformation. He believed that all authority, religious and secular, can be derived only from God. And he attacked the worldliness of the medieval church. In 1377 Pope Gregory XI, 1329–1378, accused Wycliffe of heresy, but the reformer escaped trial. Nevertheless, he spent the rest of his life under the watchful eye of the Church, which did everything in its power to curtail Wycliffe's activities, eventually forcing him to retire. He managed to initiate the first complete translation of the Bible, which was finished by his followers. As an early leader of the Reformation, the Anglican priest William Tyndale, c. 1494–1536, believed that the scriptures needed to be available to everyone, not just the scholarly or learned. So he began translating the New Testament and the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, from Greek and Hebrew into English. He also referred to his friend Martin Luther's, 1483–1546, German translation of the Bible. But Tyndale was unable to get his English translation published at home in England, where the Anglican Church was determined to seize the work. In 1524 he fled the country for Germany, where he worked for the next 5 years to get his translations into print. Copies of it were smuggled back into England. Eventually he was arrested in Antwerp, Belgium, and condemned for heresy by the Roman Catholic Church. Tyndale was burned at the stake in 1536. His version later became the chief basis for the King James Version of the Bible, 1611.
What was the Reformation?
It was a religious movement in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries. It fomented inside the Catholic Church as people began questioning the Church's doctrines, practices, and authority. While the movement was preceded by a swelling dissatisfaction with the Church, the Reformation was officially, and some would say abruptly, begun in October 1517 when German monk and theology professor Martin Luther, 1483–1546, nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg, Saxony, Germany, launching an attack on the church. The movement continued through the 30 Years' War, 1618–48. And though the resolution to that conflict brought about a measure of religious stability in Europe, the force of the Reformation did not end there. Both the freedom of dissent and the Protestantism people know today are the byproducts of the movement.
What was the Reformation?
It was a religious movement in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries. It fomented inside the Catholic Church as people began questioning the Church's doctrines, practices, and authority. While the movement was preceded by a swelling dissatisfaction with the Church, the Reformation was officially, and some would say abruptly, begun in October 1517 when German monk and theology professor Martin Luther, 1483–1546, nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg, Saxony, Germany, launching an attack on the church. The movement continued through the 30 Years' War, 1618–48. And though the resolution to that conflict brought about a measure of religious stability in Europe, the force of the Reformation did not end there. Both the freedom of dissent and the Protestantism people know today are the byproducts of the movement.
What caused the Reformation?
The religious movement during the 16th century also had political and cultural causes. As more and more people were converted to Christianity during the Middle Ages, 500–1350, the Pope's sphere of influence gradually increased, giving him greater authority than many secular rulers. This supremacy was defended by Pope Innocent III, c. 1160–1216, one of the most prominent figures of the Middle Ages, who asserted that the Church should rightly retain its full power in both secular and spiritual matters. But in Western Europe, the monarchs became increasingly powerful as peasants began moving away from their farms and villages and to the emerging cities, which were protected by kings and emperors. The European monarchs often opposed the Pope, regarding him as a leader of a foreign state. This conflict continued for centuries. In 1309 Pope Clement V, c. 1260–1314, did something that would later divide the Roman Catholic Church when, being French himself, he moved the papacy from Rome to Avignon, France, where it stayed for 70 years. When Pope Gregory XI, 1329–1378, moved it back to Rome in 1377, some French cardinals objected and elected a pope of their own, an anti-pope, installing him at Avignon. This resulted in two popes claiming supremacy. And in 1409 the situation grew more complicated when a third pope was added in Pisa, Italy. Not only had the power struggle divided the Church, it had created tremendous confusion for the people, who further perceived that there were corrupt practices at work in the Church. These included the selling of church positions and indulgences, pardons for sins, as well as the lavish lifestyle enjoyed by the bishops and the Pope, which was on a par with that of royalty. While these injustices were decried by critics, the abuses did not stop. As a remedy, some began to think that the Church should be led not by the Pope but by church councils. Dissatisfaction with the Church also extended to its message, which had turned away from God's mercy and the teachings of Jesus Christ, instead focusing on a life of good works as the way to salvation. Europe was also in the midst of the Renaissance, 1350 to 1600, which saw a proliferation in the number of universities. The circulation of printed materials, thanks to the advent of the movable type printing press, and broader study of classic texts as well as of the Holy Scriptures in their original languages instead of how they had been handed down in translation by the Church. Before long, a middle class of educated people emerged in Europe. These circumstances combined to bring about a period of religious reform that lasted until 1648. The movement itself, however, continued to exert influence through its emphasis on personal responsibility, individual freedom, and the secularization of society.
What caused the Reformation?
The religious movement during the 16th century also had political and cultural causes. As more and more people were converted to Christianity during the Middle Ages, 500-1350, the Pope's sphere of influence gradually increased, giving him greater authority than many secular rulers. This supremacy was defended by Pope Innocent III, c. 1160 to 1216, one of the most prominent figures of the Middle Ages, who asserted that the Church should rightly retain its full power in both secular and spiritual matters. But in Western Europe, the monarchs became increasingly powerful as peasants began moving away from their farms and villages and to the emerging cities, which were protected by kings and emperors. The European monarchs often opposed the Pope, regarding him as a leader of a foreign state. This conflict continued for centuries. In 1309 Pope Clement V, c. 1260 to 1314, did something that would later divide the Roman Catholic Church when, being French himself, he moved the papacy from Rome to Avignon, France, where it stayed for 70 years. When Pope Gregory XI, 1329 to 1378, moved it back to Rome in 1377, some French cardinals objected and elected a pope of their own, an anti-pope, installing him at Avignon. This resulted in two popes claiming supremacy. And in 1409 the situation grew more complicated when a third pope was added in Pisa, Italy. Not only had the power struggle divided the Church, it had created tremendous confusion for the people, who further perceived that there were corrupt practices at work in the Church. These included the selling of church positions and indulgences, pardons for sins, as well as the lavish lifestyle enjoyed by the bishops and the Pope, which was on a par with that of royalty. While these injustices were decried by critics, the abuses did not stop. As a remedy, some began to think that the Church should be led not by the Pope but by church councils. Dissatisfaction with the Church also extended to its message, which had turned away from God's mercy and the teachings of Jesus Christ, instead focusing on a life of good works as the way to salvation. Europe was also in the midst of the Renaissance, 1350 to 1600, which saw a proliferation in the number of universities. The circulation of printed materials, thanks to the advent of the movable type printing press, and broader study of classic texts as well as of the Holy Scriptures in their original languages instead of how they had been handed down in translation by the Church. Before long, a middle class of educated people emerged in Europe. These circumstances combined to bring about a period of religious reform that lasted until 1648. The movement itself, however, continued to exert influence through its emphasis on personal responsibility, individual freedom, and the secularization of society.